Hey everyone, and a huge shout out to our friend Damaris and all you lovely, beautiful Chaos podcast listeners out there tuning in to our deep dive today. So we're tackling a question today that, well, it sounds really simple at first. What's normal?
Hmm.
But it gets, well,
Yeah.
complicated pretty fast,
Yeah.
especially when you start thinking about the human brain.
Yeah, that's true. I
Yeah,
mean, when you think about all the different ways that our brains work, trying to define normal is, well, it can be kind of tricky.
right.
And that's where this whole idea of neurodiversity comes in. It really challenges us to rethink those old labels,
Yeah,
normal versus abnormal.
exactly. So neurodiversity kind of suggests that conditions that we often think of as deficits,
Hmm.
like autism or ADHD or
Yeah.
dyslexia, maybe they're not deficits at all. Maybe they're just variations in how our brains are wired.
Yeah, it's like instead of looking at these differences as problems to be fixed, we should be looking at how they contribute to all the richness and the variety of the human experience.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. This concept of neurodiversity, it really gained traction in the late 1990s
Okay.
and was actually inspired by the concept of biodiversity, like in the natural world.
Right.
Judy Singer, she was an Australian sociologist, and she argued that just like a diverse ecosystem is more resilient and adaptable, a neurodiverse society, well, it might be more creative and innovative too.
So instead of trying to make everyone fit into this one tiny box of normal, we should be celebrating all those different ways of thinking and being.
Exactly. And this perspective has been particularly embraced by the social justice movement. They emphasize acceptance and challenging the idea that neurological differences are somehow a pathology.
That's really interesting. But how do we balance this idea of embracing differences with the fact that some people who are neurodivergent, they do face some real challenges,
Yeah.
challenges that might require some extra support?
That's a great point. It's a really complex conversation for sure, and one that's been evolving over time. If we look back at the case of Kim Peek, he was the inspiration for that movie Rain Man. It really highlights how our understanding of neurodiversity and diagnosis has changed.
Oh, yeah. I remember that movie.
So Kim Peek, he had this incredible memory, but he also had a hard time with social interactions and communication.
Right.
So he was initially diagnosed with autism,
Uh-huh.
but then in 2008, doctors took another look at his case. They did some MRI scans, and they suggested that maybe he actually had FG syndrome, which is a genetic condition.
Wow. So even with someone as well known as Kim Peek, there's still so much we're learning about diagnosis and neurodiversity.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that diagnosis can be really complicated, especially when it comes to autism. I mean, we've seen this huge increase in autism diagnoses. It's gone up almost fivefold in the US
Wow.
and even more in the UK over the last 20 years.
So does that mean there are actually more people with autism now than there were before?
Well, not necessarily. While there's still a lot of research going on, experts think this increase is probably due to a few key factors. For one thing, there's much more awareness about autism now than there was 20 years ago. So more people are seeking out diagnoses.
That makes sense. People might be recognizing signs in themselves or their children that they didn't have the words for before.
Exactly. And we've also got much better screening methods now. We're getting better at identifying autism in people who might not have fit those traditional diagnostic criteria.
So it might not be that more people have autism, but that we're just getting better at recognizing it.
Exactly. And importantly, we're starting to recognize the spectrum nature of autism.
Okay.
We're moving away from this idea that there's only one way autism presents itself, and we're starting to understand that it manifests in a whole variety of ways.
Well, that's interesting.
And actually, we've seen a decrease in the proportion of people who are diagnosed with severe autism, especially those with intellectual disabilities.
So it sounds like we're starting to get a much more nuanced and accurate understanding of what autism really looks like.
We are, and this whole idea of a spectrum, it applies to neurodiversity as a whole. It's
Okay.
not just one category, it's a whole range of conditions,
Mhm.
like ASD, ADHD, dyslexia, and every individual falls somewhere along this spectrum.
Right.
And it reinforces the idea that there really isn't one definition of normal that fits everyone.
It really challenges that black and white thinking.
It does. And it also highlights the limitations of our traditional diagnostic criteria, diagnosis.
Mm.
Especially for autism, it can be really subjective.
Yeah.
And there's always a chance of underdiagnosis. Particularly in girls, they often present autistic traits differently than boys.
I've read about that, like how girls might be more likely to mask their autistic traits,
Right.
which makes it harder to identify.
Exactly. It makes you realize just how much we still have to learn about all the different ways neurodiversity can show up. And it reminds us that our understanding of neurodiversity is still evolving. I mean, think back to some of those early theories about autism, like that whole refrigerator mother theory, which blamed autism on mothers being cold and uncaring.
Oh, wow.
It's completely debunked now, but it shows how far we've come in separating scientific understanding from harmful social biases.
It makes you wonder what other assumptions we might still be holding on to today, even without realizing it.
That's a good question. And that's why it's so important to approach this whole conversation with humility and be open to challenging our own preconceived notions.
So if we're trying to move away from viewing neurodiversity only through a lens of deficits, what are some of the positive aspects we should be focusing on?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And I think that's really key to truly embracing neurodiversity. One of the most fascinating ideas in this area is what's called niche construction.
Niche construction?
Yeah. It's the idea that people who are neurodivergent, they can actually create environments that play to their strengths and minimize the impact of any challenges they might face.
So instead of trying to force everyone to fit into one mold, we should be recognizing that different people thrive in different settings.
Exactly. For instance, people with ADHD, they often do really well in fast-paced dynamic environments, where their energy and their ability to think outside the box are actually valuable assets.
Oh, I see.
Think about careers like entrepreneurship or emergency medicine, on the other hand. Some folks with autism, they thrive in fields that require a lot of attention to detail and a deep understanding of systems, like software engineering or data analysis.
So it's all about finding the right fit for each individual.
It is. And assistive technologies play a big role in this too, Things like text-to-speech software for people with dyslexia or specialized keyboards for those with motor challenges. These tools can help neurodivergent individuals overcome certain obstacles and access information more effectively.
It's like we're finally starting to understand that there's no one right way to learn or work or even just be, and that diversity of thought and approach can actually benefit all of us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone has something unique to offer.
Yeah.
And that we can all learn and grow from each other's differences.
Yeah, it really is a shift in how we think about all of this, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you think, have we been kind of missing out by designing our systems and structures around this really narrow definition of normal?
That's a really important question. And the book, The Power of Neurodiversity, really dives into this idea. It argues that we need to rethink how we view the brain. And it says the brain's more like an ecosystem.
Than like a machine.
Okay, an ecosystem.
Yeah.
How does that help us understand neurodiversity?
Well, think about it. We're so used to thinking about the brain in terms of all these specific parts and functions, like it's a machine.
Right.
But if we think about it as an ecosystem, with all its interconnectedness and diversity and how it adapts, then neurodiversity just becomes a natural variation, not a malfunction.
So instead of trying to find the one broken part to fix, we're recognizing how complex the whole system is.
Exactly. And just like in a natural ecosystem, that diversity actually makes the whole system healthier and more resilient.
Okay.
Neurodivergent individuals, they're often really good at creating their own little niches within this ecosystem, environments where they can really thrive.
Could you give an example of what that looks like?
Sure. The book talks about this young boy named Eddie,
Okay.
who really struggled in a traditional classroom. He was labeled as having ADHD. And he felt frustrated and out of place a lot of the time.
Right.
But then Eddie joined this community arts organization.
Okay.
And suddenly, his energy and enthusiasm were seen as assets.
Wow.
He thrived in that environment. He found a place where his unique way of being wasn't just accepted, but celebrated.
So it wasn't that Eddie needed to be fixed. It was about finding an environment where he could be himself and flourish.
Exactly. And that's niche construction in action. And it's not just for people with ADHD either. Think about individuals with dyslexia. They often excel in visual and spatial thinking.
Right.
And they've been incredibly successful in fields like design and architecture, even entrepreneurship.
Where those skills are really valuable.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how many people out there have amazing talents.
Yeah.
But we're just not seeing them because they're not in the right environment to thrive.
That's a really important point. It highlights how important it is to move away from that one-size-fits-all model and create systems that recognize and support all these different cognitive styles and abilities.
And speaking of historical context, the power of neurodiversity Also talks about how societal perceptions of neurodiversity have changed over time. It's fascinating how what's considered normal can be so different depending on the culture and the time period.
It really is. What might be seen as a disorder in one context could actually be an advantage in another.
Right.
Take ADHD, for example. The book suggests that in a hunter-gatherer society, traits like hyperactivity and impulsivity and being really aware of your surroundings, well, those could have been crucial for survival.
That's interesting.
So maybe what we see as disorders today were actually adaptive traits in a different environment.
Makes you think.
It does. It challenges us to constantly question our assumptions about what's normal and what's abnormal. We're still learning. Our understanding of neurodiversity is always evolving.
I'm also curious about the role of technology in all of this. It seems like it can be both a barrier and a tool for empowering people, depending on how it's used.
Absolutely. On the one hand, technology that's poorly designed can create real obstacles for neurodivergent individuals. Imagine a website that's really difficult to navigate for someone with dyslexia, or a social media platform that's just completely overwhelming for someone with autism.
I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah,
But I've also heard about how technology can be really helpful in making environments more inclusive and accessible.
it can. Assistive technologies, like text-to-speech software or noise-canceling headphones or even specialized keyboards, those can make a huge difference in helping neurodivergent individuals fully participate in all aspects of life.
So it's really important to design technology with accessibility and inclusivity in mind right from the start.
It is, and that same principle applies to education, too. We're seeing a shift away from those more traditional deficit-based models of special education and moving towards a more strengths-based approach that really celebrates neurodiversity.
So what does that look like in a classroom?
Well, one key element is the move towards inclusive classrooms, where students with all sorts of learning needs are integrated into the mainstream setting.
So instead of separating students based on their differences, we're creating learning environments that embrace those differences.
Exactly. And within these inclusive classrooms, there's a growing emphasis on what's called differentiated instruction.
Okay.
Teachers are adapting their teaching methods to meet the needs of different learning styles and strengths.
That sounds much more in line with the whole idea of neurodiversity.
It is. It's about recognizing that every student learns differently and providing them with the support they need to succeed.
And the power of neurodiversity talks about some schools that are doing this really well.
They are. They're creating these inclusive, neurodiverse classrooms.
It sounds like they're paving the way for a much more equitable and engaging educational experience for everyone.
They are. And it's not just happening in schools. The workplace is starting to recognize the value of neurodiversity, too.
Like that company, Special Stern, I read about them. They specifically hire people on the autism spectrum for software testing roles.
Right.
And they've been really successful.
Specialist Stern is a great example of how embracing neurodiversity can benefit everyone, both the employees and the company.
It shows that with the right support and accommodations, neurodivergent individuals can really excel.
They can. But it does require a shift in mindset from those traditional hiring practices. You know, the ones that often prioritize conformity?
Yeah.
More and more companies are realizing that neurodiversity can actually be a competitive advantage. Well, neurodivergent individuals often bring unique skills and perspectives to the table. That can lead to more innovation and better problem solving.
So it's not just about checking a box for diversity. It's about truly valuing and integrating different ways of thinking into the company culture.
Exactly. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected and empowered to contribute their unique talents.
And that takes a real commitment.
It does. It takes training and resources and policies that support different working styles and needs.
It's a lot of work,
It is.
but it sounds like the potential benefits are worth it.
I think so.
But before we get too carried away with all the positive aspects, we should probably talk about something we touched on earlier, the ethical implications of labeling and potentially trying to fix neurodivergent individuals.
It's a big question for sure, and it's one that the neurodiversity movement is really wrestling with. You know, on the one hand, there's this desire to stop thinking of neurodiversity as a disease, as something that needs to be cured.
Right, because that can create so much stigma and make people feel like they need to change who they are.
Absolutely, but at the same time, we have to recognize that some folks, they do face some real challenges because of their neurodiversity, and they might need support or accommodations or even medical interventions.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we support those who need it without sending the message that neurodiversity is inherently broken?
Yeah, that's the tough part, isn't it? And honestly, There are no easy answers. It's a conversation that we need to keep having.
A conversation that needs to involve everyone. Neurodivergent individuals and their families, educators, healthcare professionals,
Mhm.
and society as a whole.
Exactly. We need to have these conversations with respect and empathy, and with a commitment to making sure that everyone can live a full and meaningful life, no matter how their brain is wired.
So it's about finding that middle ground, providing support without trying to erase or normalize someone's unique identity.
Right. And it's important to remember that even the neurodiversity movement itself, well, it's diverse. There's no one single viewpoint. There's a whole spectrum of perspectives on these really complex issues.
So it's an ongoing journey
Right.
of understanding and acceptance and learning.
It is. And it's a journey that requires us to be really honest with ourselves about our own biases and preconceptions, about what it means to be normal.
That seems to be a recurring theme here, challenging those deeply ingrained assumptions. But how can our listeners take all of this and apply it to their own lives, even if they don't identify as neurodivergent themselves?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. Learn about the different ways neurodiversity can manifest. Read books, listen to podcasts, talk to neurodivergent people and their families. The more we understand about neurodiversity, the better we'll be at creating environments that are inclusive and supportive.
So expanding our understanding of what normal can be.
Exactly. And challenging our own definitions. Ask yourself, where did my idea of normal come from? Is it actually preventing me from seeing and appreciating the value of diversity?
And I imagine empathy is a big part of it too, really trying to see the world from the perspective of someone who experiences it differently than you do.
Empathy is essential. Try to imagine the challenges someone might face. Trying to navigate a world that wasn't designed for their way of thinking and processing information.
And if you're interacting with someone who you know is neurodivergent,
Yeah.
be patient, be understanding, and respect their needs and preferences.
Right, meet people where they are. And remember, it's not about fixing them. It's about creating a world where everyone feels valued and respected and empowered to contribute their unique talents.
And just like a diverse ecosystem is stronger and more resilient, a neurodiverse society has so much potential for creativity, innovation, and success. We all benefit from embracing these differences.
I completely agree. And I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that neurodiversity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a fundamental part of what makes us human. It's a beautiful reminder that there's no one right way to be.
I love that. So as we continue to learn and grow in our understanding of the brain and its amazing capacity for variation, let's make sure our actions, our attitudes, and our systems reflect that understanding.
And as you go about your day today, I encourage you to look at the world through a neurodiversity lens. You might be surprised at the beauty, the brilliance, and the potential you discover when you open yourself up to different ways of being.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into neurodiversity. We hope you learned something new and that you'll join us in embracing the beautiful chaos of the human brain in all its diverse glory.